Good afternoon, everyone. If you are just now joining us, we're going to start in a few minutes. We're just waiting for everyone to load into the webinar. We have quite a few attendees today, so it'll just take a minute or two so we can allow everyone to load in. Hi, everyone. If you're just now joining, we're just waiting just a minute or so to let everyone load into the webinar, and then we'll go ahead and get started. All right, it looks like we have most people in the webinar. So thank you so much for being here today. My name is Jamie Moore, and I'm a practice management advisor at the Florida Bar. And I want to welcome you to today's webinar, Understanding PTSD and Secondary Trauma for Legal Professionals. During the webinar, if you have a question for the presenter, please post it in the question and answer section at the bottom of the screen. And if we have time, we'll get to those questions at the end. Some of the questions will be answered, and perhaps we might not get to all of them, but we'll do our best to answer whatever is posted. At the end of the webinar, attendees will be provided with the course number, and you will use that to self-report the credits in the member portal. And now for a brief disclaimer, CLE presentations are intended for educational purposes only and do not replace professional judgment. Statements of fact and opinions expressed are those of the presenters individually, and unless expressly stated to the contrary, are not the opinion of the Florida Bar or its committees. The Florida Bar does not endorse or approve and assumes no responsibility for the content, accuracy, or completeness of the information presented. Any feedback should be provided to the event organizer. If you have questions, you can email legalfuel@floridabar.org. Again, that is legalfuel@floridabar.org. And at this time, it is my privilege to introduce Dr. Jennifer Lee. Dr. Lee is a clinical psychologist at the Miami VA Medical Center. She works with the Veterans Justice Outreach Program and provides evaluation, treatment, and intensive case management and veterans involved in Broward Veterans Court, which is the largest veterans court in the state of Florida. She also provides community outreach and training for local law enforcement, attorneys, and judges on understanding veterans, PTSD, and vicarious trauma for legal professionals. Dr. Lee completed her undergraduate degree from Willamette University in Salem, Oregon, and earned her doctorate in clinical psychology from the Wright Institute in Berkeley, California, with a dissertation study focused on homeless women and trauma. Thank you, Dr. Lee, for presenting today, and now I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, and I'm so happy that we have many participants that are joining us for this talk today. So I appreciate your interest in understanding trauma responses and how it can impact legal professionals. There's a few things. My background, I mean, as she mentioned, I've been with the VA for about 16 years, and I was also a Navy veteran and worked with people in Iraq in the combat zone and military members. So I have a long history of working a lot with military and veterans with PTSD, but anyone can have post-traumatic stress disorder, not just veterans. And so it's my pleasure to be able to talk to you today so that legal professionals, attorneys particularly, can learn about what post-traumatic stress disorder is. So that's my first goal for today. I think that most people don't go to court for happy reasons, unfortunately, and many of the people and the clients that you work with have experienced significant trauma in their lives, and it's important for you to be able to understand what that effect is on them and how they might present to you, or how it might interfere or influence your interactions with those folks in and out of the courtroom, so that you can have empathy and also be most effective as you can be. The second thing I want to do today is to talk about the signs and symptoms of secondary traumatic stress for legal professionals. So that's for you all. You need to recognize these signs and symptoms early, so that they can be managed in constructive, healthy ways, and hopefully it would help you to reduce the likelihood of having, disciplinary problems or having these kinds of secondary trauma impact negatively your work with your clients. And then the last thing related to that is I'm going to go over a few self-care practices and also kind of organizational things that you could think about to help reduce the likelihood for traumatic stress responses and also be able to manage it. So there is a lot more emphasis recently, and I'm thrilled about it, for courts being more trauma informed. I'm sure many of you have heard of this, but Sam, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, sort of the federal level, they say that a court is trauma informed, realizes the widespread impact of trauma, and understands the paths for recovery, recognizes the signs of symptoms of trauma in clients, families, staff, and others involved in the system, and responds by fully integrating the knowledge about the trauma into the policies, procedures, and practices and also resist actively re-traumatizing people. So today we're really going to be focusing on recognizing the signs and symptoms aspect of this goal. Okay, so one of the things I want to first go through is what is post-traumatic stress. There's a lot more awareness in society now about this, but there are also some misconceptions and things like that. So I want you to understand what it is from a mental health practitioner's view so that you can help to recognize it, right, in people you're working with and also in yourselves and in others. So trauma is basically, it's an event that is considered traumatic when it's a threat, sudden or unexpected death or serious injury, or the threat of death or serious injury. And it can be something that people are exposed to directly. So it's actually a threat to them, to their life or limb or, integrity. It could be that you're witnessing that happening to someone else. So maybe it's not happening to you, but you're seeing it happen to someone else. Example I think of is kids in domestic violence situations. Maybe they're not being abused, but they're witnessing their mother, or father being abused. It could also be a trauma if you're indirectly learning about a close relative or a close friend who is exposed to trauma. This one was kind of added later, and it's a little confusing even for a lot of mental health professionals, but basically it's kind of like you're exposed to the details of something happening to someone that you really love and care about to the point that you go on to develop PTSD. And a good example I can think of is like maybe a mother who hears about her children being killed in an accident and hears about what happened, even though she wasn't there. And then she goes on to have post-traumatic stress disorder related to driving or to, that accident in some way. And then the last one, which I think is exactly, really the focus of what we're looking at today as well, is repeated or extreme indirect exposure to adversive details of the event, usually in the course of professional duties. So that could be, first responders, it could be therapists, mental health workers, but also legal professionals, right? And so this is important for you to know that you guys are also exposed to trauma. And trauma is not grief. So it's not like if you've heard about someone who was dying from a illness, that over time that's different. It's grief. Having some sort of significant life stressors like divorce or work stress, things like that. People sort of say, oh, I have PTSD and kind of throw that around, but that's really not what we would call a trauma per se from a mental health perspective when you're looking at post-traumatic stress. Types of trauma: violence, sexual abuse, severe accidents, terrorism, mass shootings, combat and war, natural disasters. I mean, you get the idea, torture. And if you think about like all the things that your clients have experienced, and often people, it's not just one thing, but it could be a multiple traumas over time. And that's what we would call complex trauma. And these traumas affect how they present to you. It affects how they function in life. It might affect how they present in court. It might be their behavior outside of court. It could have been contributing to why they're in the court in the first place, that maybe they have criminal charges or something like that, that is a result or partially or fully related to their traumatic experience that they've had. And then I also want you to think about what kinds of traumatic experience have you had in your life, even from childhood, in the past. And, a lot of times people sort of try to avoid that or bury it or pretend like that doesn't have an impact, or maybe they're not aware it has an impact, but those things also are important to recognize. So during a traumatic event, basically your brain sort of takes a snapshot of that traumatic event. And it's interesting that usually the memories of a trauma are very vivid. Um, my thought and some of the research I've read is that it's because it's kind of a protective factor, that if you can remember all of the details around something that was a threat to your life, um, then next time if you are faced with those things, then you're going to be able to respond and survive, right? So it's kind of like a survival response. Some people say maybe people who develop post-traumatic stress disorder over time are just really programmed to survive, that maybe they're just very adapted to that. But what happens is people then react with that same sort of fight or flight response, and to other situations in life long after the trauma that remind them of that event, and it causes them to have sort of these symptoms that I'm going to go into. They sort of overgeneralize the fight or flight response to threats, even that may not be threats, but to them it could be because of the trauma that they went through. When we're thinking about PTSD from a mental health perspective, there's sort of 4 different clusters of symptoms, and I want you to understand these. The first is having intrusive thoughts and memories of the trauma. And those can occur in the daytime, or they could be at night in the form of nightmares, or both. And it's usually memories that are upsetting and are of the most painful aspects of the thing that the person was exposed to. The other thing is avoidance of trauma reminders and emotions. And so basically people, it makes sense, after you've been through something really upsetting and traumatizing, that you don't want to really talk about it. You don't want to feel the feelings associated with it. You don't want to go in situations or be around people or places or things that remind you of that, because it brings up all of those old feelings. But you have to think about, maybe some of the people that you're working with, they might not want to go to court. They might not want to participate in, sort of discussions about finding facts or depositions or testimony or anything that would bring up those memories. A lot of times they'll avoid those. The third cluster of symptoms, and I'm not going to go, into each one of these in detail, but sort of this is things that everyone with PTSD will have some of symptoms within each one of these clusters. But the other one is negative thoughts and feelings about yourself and the world. And that can be in the form of sort of guilt and shame, self-blame. It could be blaming others, feeling alienated from the world, a change in how you view the world as being more dangerous, or that bad things are going to happen, or that there's bad people out there. And then the last is arousal and reactivity to trauma cues. So that's, again, kind of more along the lines what I mentioned of those fight or flight responses that people have. And they sort of can become easily angered, hypervigilant, sort of looking for things to happen, difficulty with concentration, difficulty with sleep. Sometimes people even engage in sort of self-destructive behaviors as well. But anyway, those are the 4 clusters. You want to consider that trauma reactions are not the same for everyone, right? So post-traumatic stress disorder is across all cultures and all time. I mean, it goes back to even, Greek and Roman writings. There's accounts of basically what we would now call PTSD. So it's a part of a human experience. But the trauma reactions vary depending on the circumstances that the person experienced, like the trauma. So it just to use sort of military example, if I worked with a woman who was sexually assaulted in her barracks room at night by 2 men, versus another veteran who had an IED explosion on a patrol in the streets of Iraq, and saw people, injured and killed. Those types of the triggers that those 2 people might have and their symptoms might vary. So while it's still hypervigilance, it's still avoidance, it's still negative thoughts, etc. But each of within that, those would be very specific. So the woman who was sexually assaulted was afraid of the darkness, or certain men, or being alone, things like that. The veteran with an IED explosion might be really hypersensitive to noises, to crowded situations, etc. Right? So you kind of get my idea on that one. Acute distress disorder is basically the same symptoms of PTSD, but it's when it lasts for a few days or a few weeks. Then we don't even call it PTSD. We would call it acute distress disorder, or maybe it's really not even a disorder. It's just your mind and your body kind of processing what you went through. So a lot of those things are normal. And like I said, some people go on to have the symptoms for a longer period of time. So once it gets to be a few months, then we start to call it PTSD. It has to interfere significantly with your daily functioning. There's a range of severity of trauma reactions in PTSD. So sometimes people will have very mild symptoms, just maybe one or two of those clusters that's causing some impairment, but not super significant, versus some people who really can barely even leave their house, or they're in and out of the hospital. I mean, there's sort of a really wide range of PTSD responses, and it's in a range. It's a treatable condition. I want people to remember that as we go through this talk. And it's something that I really enjoyed when I was working with veterans with PTSD. People say, well, how can you work with people listening to all this trauma all the time? But really, it is such a treatable condition in a short amount of time. And you could see people change and recover and just have such a different outlook and ability to function in life. It was really rewarding. So it is treatable. And like I said, it's a part of being human. It's not a sign of weakness or anything like that. So some of the things we look at with the development of PTSD is like how frequently someone was exposed to trauma. So if it was domestic violence that was happening over and over in the home, or maybe somebody who was in the foster care system who was like in different situations of trauma, or growing up in neighborhoods where shootings or death or violence was a frequent thing, or military veterans who are in multiple combat operations. Those things make people more prone to develop PTSD. And if you think about with legal professionals, if you're working in a unit where you have a high frequency of exposure to traumatic material, then those folks are more at risk. The other thing is how close you are to the trauma. So was it something that happened, far away, or was it right next to you? How long did it last? The actual traumatic event itself, the longer it lasts, the more risk of developing PTSD. And then the last one is the sense of responsibility for the trauma. And it doesn't mean that it's rational. It just means psychologically, how much do you feel as though what happened that you could have, should have, or would have changed it or done something different? Then those folks can be haunted by it for years, and those people tend to have higher rates of PTSD. That last one was really actually the most correlated with why people develop PTSD. Some other risk factors are women develop PTSD more, but I also think that women are victims of sexual assault and rape by much more frequently than men are. So that probably accounts for that higher rate of PTSD for women. Some statistics say 1 in 5 women have been sexually assaulted or raped at some point in their life, which is really high. Less education is a risk factor. If you have a history of childhood abuse or trauma, that is a risk factor. It tends to be sort of cumulative. Again, it's sort of that frequency of the exposure that we talked about. If you have other mental health problems, that puts you at more risk for PTSD. A family history of mental health issues, and lack of social support is actually one of the biggest factors that research shows makes people more at risk for trauma reactions. So the more isolated, the fewer people that you have to talk to and share about not just the trauma, but just love and support in your life, and the more at risk you are to develop PTSD, and also the longer the recovery takes as well. If someone is injured during the trauma or has physical pain, those are more at risk, and then more life stress and the greater perceived threat during the trauma is also a risk factor. Okay, So this is just sort of some statistics. They vary a little bit depending on what studies you're looking at and which populations, et cetera. But most people experience at least one traumatic event in their life, and 50 to 89% have exposure to some kind of trauma during their lifetime in the United States. 6.8% of adults in the US have PTSD at some point in their life. Again, it's higher for women than for men. So it's an overall rate of about 7%. The highest rates of PTSD are for veterans, refugees, American Indians, heavy substance users, transgender individuals, emergency responders, and homeless. And also, I'm going to go into it, but legal professionals also have higher rates of PTSD. 95% of rape victims met PTSD criteria within 2 weeks of the rape, and then 41.7 after 6 months. So as you can see, a lot of the symptoms will tend to diminish initially, and then only a certain percentage will go on to develop PTSD over time. PTSD, the thing that complicates it is it doesn't often, occur just in isolation. There's 50% of those with post-traumatic stress also meet criteria for depression. 20 to 40% plus or minus, depending on the studies, have substance abuse disorders. Again, that's sort of there's a bidirectional relationship between substance abuse and trauma. Sometimes people start with the substance abuse, which then puts them in a lifestyle that makes them at risk for trauma. And then once they have trauma, then they can be more at risk for using substances to cope, et cetera. So you can kind of see how those things interplay. Anxiety, symptom disorders are also common, like panic disorder, phobias, obsessive compulsives. And the way it's treated now is we treat everything together. When I first started in the field, it tended to be like, okay, we need to look at the substance abuse first, then we'll look at the trauma, or we need to do this one and then this one. But now it's the way it's done is just sort of all at once. If we look at trauma and justice involved populations, right, this is your, what a lot of you folks are working with, especially if you're in the criminal divisions. But male prisoners have 21% have PTSD. Female is about 61%, so much higher rates. Offenders with substance use disorders is about 20 to 40% also have PTSD. So that's about like what the numbers that we were looking at with the coexisting. Justice involved women, 78% report a history of childhood or adult abuse. Military veterans that are involved in the justice system have about 50 to 73% rate of PTSD. Foster children, more than half reported sexual abuse before placement, 28% physically abused or neglected. If you're working with youth in the juvenile justice system, it's no surprise that the very high rates of trauma, 30 to 80%. And the homeless, PTSD is the most prevalent non-substance use disorder for the homeless. And I just have to sort of put a little plug in here. I work with the Veterans Court, as she mentioned, in Broward County, but there are veterans courts all across the state of Florida, which is one of many different types of problem-solving courts. But, having, if you are working with criminal divisions, just making sure that you look into the Veterans Court as an option for those folks, because that way people can, or the other problem solving courts too, for women or, sex traffic survivors, things like that. It can really get those folks into a court system that's going to be sensitive to their trauma backgrounds and be able to address those most appropriately. Okay. So where are we here? Okay. So now I'm going to go into the secondary traumatic stress reactions. And it's basically the cumulative stress resulting from helping traumatized or suffering people. And I think this is something that so many legal professionals face. There's other words for it: vicarious traumatization, compassionate fatigue, indirect trauma, burnout is also associated. And I would say it's just really, we're wired as human beings to feel empathy and to care and to feel the pain of others that we're exposed to. And that's really just a part of our hardwiring in our brains to, neuron system that mirrors others. And it's not something you choose, but it is something that is a consequence of knowing and caring and facing trauma of people that you're working with. And anyone can experience secondary trauma. So it could be first responders, mental health, attorneys, judges, volunteers, advocates, support staff, jurors. You need to think about all of the people involved in the legal system that might be having exposure to traumatic material. So secondary trauma really, it's when the professional develops some of those same symptoms that I was talking about with the PTSD diagnosis, but it's related to that helping profession that you're in. And it can be intrusive thoughts and memories, that are upsetting to you. It could be in the day at night, avoiding, withdrawal, tension, alterations in your basic sort of thoughts about people and society and safety and yourself. And depending on the kinds of things that you're exposed to, again, some of those reactions could vary depending on if you're working with kids a lot or if you're working with women that you're, sort of identifying with women who are being abused, these kinds of things, it can vary. And it mimics PTSD reactions. And it can have a really pervasive impact on people's functioning at work and at home. And it can impair, people being able to provide excellent legal service. And, unfortunately, sometimes it can also lead to disciplinary problems. And, when you sort of least expect it. And sometimes that's related back to having this cumulative exposure to trauma. Okay. So some examples of trauma exposure for legal professionals are like listening to other people describe violence, murder, abuse. It can be reading reports or viewing videos or images of crimes that are gruesome or upsetting. Working with children who are adults who are physically or sexually abused or harmed. Meeting with victims, witnesses regarding traumatic events. So you have to think about, who is exposed to this traumatic material. It can be not just the attorneys, but also people working in the courtroom, working in your legal offices, paralegals, courtroom support staff, everyone that's being exposed to this, especially on a repeated basis, is at risk for developing secondary trauma. And I think legal attorneys have already a lot of stress in your life. You have to sort of deal with contentious, interactions and court appearances and unhappy clients and families and demanding judges and arguing with other attorneys. Like, you have all these other things in addition to being exposed to the traumatic material. So it kind of can reduce your resiliency in the workplace. So some of the research findings on secondary trauma for legal professionals are interesting. There's a study of public defenders found symptoms of demoralization, helplessness, exhaustion, anxiety, social withdrawal. Criminal attorneys had more depression, stress, and changes in safety and intimacy than civil attorneys. In another study, and attorneys had more secondary traumatic stress than mental health professionals. And I think that might be just that a lot of our training, when I'm becoming a psychologist, their training is how to deal with that on an ongoing basis. Whereas I think law school, maybe they're better now, but I don't think they do a lot on how to cope with these things and how to care for yourself to be a better attorney. But I think law schools are starting to integrate some of that into the curriculum. Excuse me. Okay, so more research findings. Prosecutors who work with incest and domestic violence cases had more symptoms of demoralization, anxiety, helplessness, exhaustion, social withdrawal. So, if you have folks, if you or people are working with those kind of units, then they're more at risk. Attorneys had more stress than administrative support staff, and it was correlated most strongly with workload and the number of trauma exposed clients that they're working with. So those two factors were the most predictive of having secondary trauma reactions. Judges in criminal, family, and juvenile courts had the most vicarious trauma symptoms compared to other divisions. That makes sense, right? If you think about what those divisions are doing. And female judges on the bench more than 6 years were at the greatest risk for vicarious trauma or secondary trauma. Some other research findings I have here. Attorneys have high rates of depression, 28%, which is much higher than the general population, anxiety, and suicidal ideation, 8.5% versus 4.4% of the general adult population have suicidal thoughts. So it's ranked 5th occupationally for incident of suicide. Male lawyers are more likely to contemplate suicide, according to the research. Female lawyers are more at risk for anxiety, depression, and alcohol use, like problematic alcohol use is what they were talking about. Younger attorneys are less happy, especially those under 30, and loneliness is a common problem for attorneys. There are high rates of alcohol and drug use problems among attorneys nationally. You can see this statistics there. And Black, Hispanic attorneys have higher rates of depression, anxiety than white. So risk factors for trauma reactions. Again, we kind of went through risk factors for PTSD in general, and I think those apply as well. But there's some other things more specifically to the legal community we could look at, which is being female, the intensity of exposure. That was one of the ones I mentioned is the most predictive of secondary trauma, along with the long work hours. Overworking, have a large caseload, that was very predictive. Erratic pace of work, lack of success, lack of community or social support. That's really important to think about. Lack of resources, information, and training and supervision, and being new to the field. And they even found that lack of information and training about secondary trauma and about PTSD and all of those things is also a risk factor for developing secondary trauma. So it's important, and I commend all of you for going to this training because this is what helps you to be more resilient. Some of the signs of secondary trauma, this is the things that we need to look for, right, in ourselves and in others that we're working with. Some of the things can be avoidance. So that can take many forms. It could be arriving late, leaving early, missing meetings, avoiding clients, not returning phone calls, unable to listen. I mean, that's sort of a form of avoidance, right? Like you're not really hearing, you're sort of shutting things out. Maybe changing jobs a lot, and detachment for others. Those are all warning signs of avoidance. Hypervigilance. Some attorneys and legal professionals can find that they're feeling really anxious. They start to perceive clients or colleagues as threatening. Sometimes people can even, I've heard folks say that they feel unsafe in their home, or when they're out in public, they start to think about those things more frequently. Another thing is sort of a black and white perspective, and I mean sort of a loss of the balance perspective in things and not able to kind of see gray areas, just sort of putting things in an all or nothing kind of view, which can be detrimental, right? Then you're not looking at the nuances and being as effective as you can be. Being argumentative, impatient, aggressive, response style, getting into conflicts with staff, shutting down or sort of numbing out. That can be in the form of substance use, but it could just be like in other ways, just that you're not engaging as much. A loss of empathy or compassion. I think that's something that a lot of people don't realize happens, but it can kind of happen slowly and insidiously, that you start to sort of lose that caring, empathic place because it's a way of defending yourself, right? It's a way of sort of guarding, and it's a sign that you might be having this secondary trauma. Guilt, minimizing, denial, those are all things as well. In your personal life, so the ones before are sort of in the legal setting, right? Like at work, things you might notice. At home, it might be a little bit different. And so you kind of have to look at both in the workplace and at home to see if you or others are experiencing these things. It could be sleep disturbance and nightmares. Sometimes pain is interesting, can be a sign of secondary trauma, like headaches, backaches, stomach aches, things like that. Sometimes people sort of transfer that psychological distress and anxiety into physical. Extreme reactivity to reminders of the traumatic exposure. So again, those are going to vary depending on the type of cases and things that you're exposed to. But if you notice that you're starting to have a really emotional response to things, then that could be a sign. Intrusive negative thoughts, fatigue, feeling like you're kind of always chronically tired, having a negative thinking style and being irritable, strained relationships, withdrawal, compromised parenting. I mean, we like to think that it's not going to affect how we interact with our kids, but it can. It can be sort of less emotionally available to kids, being more black and white or more strict or not as listening as well. Feeling the world is not a safe place. I mentioned that people can start to sort of really look around themselves and start to see that bad things are going to happen and start thinking about that and feeling less safe. And then another really important one to think about is the destructive coping, like substance use, eating, gambling, risk taking, all of those, right, are destructive coping. And not engaging in activities that you previously enjoyed, sort of like hobbies are dwindling and you're sort of like have a narrow kind of existence outside of work that's not a lot of enjoyable activities. Okay, so what can you do? Some of the things you can do, and I like to think of it as sort of having awareness that you're having these secondary trauma responses. That's number one, right? You got to be able to look at yourself and assess yourself in a non-judgmental way and say, listen, is this something that I'm experiencing? And it doesn't mean I'm a bad person or I'm a bad attorney or a bad mom or anything, but maybe just having that awareness and openness that this could be occurring. And then looking to have balance in your life, a balance, and also connecting to others. So some of the things you can do is like some of those balance things, I think, are taking vacations. You want to make sure that you're taking your leave time. I know the chief of psychology at the VA where I work with, she's great. And one of the things that she talks about in our evaluation at the end of the year is she looks at how much vacation time you've taken. And if people haven't, she's encouraging them to do that because she sees that as a sign of people taking care of themselves and doing the things that they need to do to have a more balanced perspective. Exercising, some of these things you guys have already heard a lot, but it's just a matter of making time and a habit to do it. Exercising regularly, getting enough sleep is huge. Like if you're not sleeping enough, everything else kind of crumbles underneath that. Your mood, your concentration, your irritability, all that comes if you're not sleeping. Eating well, right? There's such a link between your physical health and your mental health. Leaving at a reasonable hour is a way you can kind of try to balance your life a little bit from work. Don't work outside of office hours except for emergency. I know it's easier said than done for many attorneys, but you really got to try to find some balance in your life and some boundaries around that workplace that can be such a stressful workplace. You got to find boundaries. Talk to loved ones about the demands of the job. Again, that goes to that like connection and social support. Doesn't mean you have to share every nitty-gritty detail of the videos and testimony you've heard, but it just means like just reaching out to people and sharing about how you feel and how things are going on for you. I mean, just on a regular basis. And it could be, spouses and family, or it could be a priest or pastor, it could be a therapist, it could be anybody who you feel like you can trust and talk to, colleagues, right? Don't check your emails, text at night or on weekends. If you can, try to set firm boundaries. Seek professional assistance when needed. It is such a luxury in life to have insurance. If you have it, use your mental health care, and no one has to know about it. It's completely your space, your time, a person that's there for you to support you and to listen to you. And it's just like such a great thing that you can do for yourself. Try to get support from trusted colleagues. And like I think I already mentioned, doing these non-judgmental self-assessments. Some of the things that you can think about as an organization, if you're in a position of leadership in your offices or in departments, I think this is a part of being like a more trauma-informed sort of justice system in the United States, is you have to really look at what can you do to manage secondary traumatization within your system. And I think also PTSD and trauma reactions for the clients too, as well. Like that's, I can do another talk on that, of how to make like courtrooms more safe places for people who are victims of trauma. But I've done talks on that, but that's sort of a little bit different. I'm going to focus here on within your organization, how can you reduce people having secondary traumatization? So you want to make sure you have training like this one, right? Going to trainings to know what it is and know that it is not a sign of weakness, and having that attitude within your culture of your office, that if people do have that, then that just means that they're a caring person. It doesn't mean that there's something wrong with them, right? Consider office culture changes, sort of flexible work schedules, downtimes, breaks, Sometimes people try to do sort of like self-report kind of measures about like, how are you doing and things like that, or just asking people how they're doing on a regular basis in a real way. And not having the expectation that people are going to have to respond to things on weekends or nights, like give them a break, like make sure that people are not expected to respond on those off times. So you're respecting their boundaries. Create a supportive atmosphere. I think having served in the military myself and having worked with veterans for my whole career, or most of my career, I think that the military is really good at training people to work as a team. And it's all about being able to have that connection with others and face obstacles. I mean, mainly war fighting, right, is their main thing that they're training, but they teach people that you have to care for each other as much as yourself or more than yourself sometimes. So having that team mentality can really buffer a lot of the stresses that your team are going to face on the job. So ask people how they're doing, their families, hobbies, interests. Have a reflective supervision style, which means that you're being like attentive and listening actively to the emotional content of the work and what people are saying to you. And I think, like I said, these really, really applies to high risk divisions where there's a lot of trauma exposure. These kinds of organizational interventions become even more important. Okay, so I'm kind of winding up here, but here are some resources. Obviously, real in crisis, anyone can dial 988. If you're working with a veteran as a client, they can also hit number 1, and they are connected with someone who is a specialist with veterans treatment, and they end up actually putting notes into their VA chart if they're in the VA. But anyone can dial 988. It's sometimes people just do just to talk and to have. It doesn't mean that you're acutely suicidal. It just means sometimes that you just need someone right now. There's the Florida Bar Association helpline. I'm also going to put on the next slide. And maybe maybe the mediator can speak a little bit about the resources that are available to people. And then here's some other websites too on here. Any sort of mindfulness, relaxation, breathing exercises online. I know it just sounds hokey and people are like, oh my God, too much of this, but just have one, that works for you. It could be a 10-minute little mindfulness, just put in your headphones and it just kind of walks you through a little breathing. But anything you can do to kind of slow down that fight or flight response that your body gets into if you're working in a really stressful situation is so healthy for you physically and mentally, and it'll make you better, more present and more able to handle things as they come in, and more present with your loved ones as well. So anything you can do to find ways, little ways, even just for a few minutes to relax and breathe and to be centered is really important. Okay, so this is the last slide. I think the mediator was going to come on, but here's the information about this course. And I think at the bottom there, it has Florida Lawyers Helpline, and you get 5 free counseling sessions per year. So you can always dial that number.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Lee.
Thank you. I'm
Yeah,
happy to take any questions. We have about 15 minutes, so feel free to ask away.
perfect. Yes, we do have one question, and so if anyone else has any questions, go ahead and put those in the Q&A box, and we'll get to as many as we can. But just want to point out there, the course number is 9218, and in order to receive credit, you will need to log into the Florida Bar Member Portal and self-report that course number and the credits, which have been approved by the Florida Bar Continuing Legal Education Department for 1 hour of General CLE credit, including 1 hour of mental health and wellness CLE credit. And also wanted to mention, as Dr. Lee had mentioned, we have the Florida Lawyers Helpline. So that is, confidential around-the-clock support for Florida Bar members. And Florida Bar members can take advantage of that and have up to 5 free counseling sessions per year. So please, look into that benefit. It's fantastic. And I'll go ahead and now look at our one question that's in here. So the attendee noted, I'm not sure if this was mentioned before, but is it possible that there are lower percentage rate of men with PTSD because less is reported, or does that have nothing to do with the statistics? And that was in regarding the slide that you had put up earlier.
Yeah, okay. Well, I think that there's so much research on it that they probably accounted for, self-reporting bias and things like that, hopefully. But you're right. I think that there is stereotypically maybe less self-reporting of all sort of mental health issues for men than women are a little more open about doing that. Um, but I think it's just, yeah, I'm not sure on that. I'd have to look at like a study to address that specifically. I really do think that the really high rates of sexual assault that women experience as children and throughout life is what accounts for a lot of it. Men in the military members have a lot higher rates of PTSD overall, but women veterans also still have higher rates than men. So even with similar experiences.
Great, thank you.
That's a good question. I wish that's something I'll have to look into a little bit more myself too.
Yeah, very good question. Let's see, one of our next questions is, do you know of any examples of PD offices set up where they're setting up talk sessions to unpack losses or traumatic case facts with each other, and how can we support each other better?
I don't work for the PD's office. I work at the VA. So, I mean, I do these talks, but I have heard, within the legal community that they're trying to do more organizational programming and efforts to have people talk about cases. But I think that would be just a really great idea, because any kind of support that people can have in an outlet reduces the risk of this secondary trauma responses drastically, and it can really benefit everyone involved, even if they haven't experienced the trauma. If they're participating in it, they can be supportive of each other and a part of that team.
Very good. Our next question here, has there been any research into pre-traumatic stress disorder for attorneys, and how might that be tied into high rates of PTSD for lawyers?
um I think the statistics that I put up there, yeah, it is higher rates. I forget exactly the exact stats I mean, I've looked at a number of different research articles, but there is, lawyers have, for example, higher rates of secondary trauma reactions than mental health providers. And I think that goes to the fact, like I was saying, that we're maybe more trained to deal with it in our training. But I think law schools are starting to think about how they can teach resilience and teach, awareness, and hopefully prevent these responses. But I think that it's some of those risk factors that we mentioned, like if you're working really long hours, if you're working in units or in departments or firms or whatever that have a lot of exposure to traumatic content, those are the folks that are at most risk for developing secondary response trauma, or it could even go on to develop as a full-blown sort of PTSD responses. It's really that like intensity of the exposure and that frequency of exposure. And people who also have had prior trauma in their lives are more at risk for developing these, legal job related PTSD too. It's kind of like, people sort of think of traumas in their life as maybe really disconnected, like maybe they had abuse or assault or something that happened when they were young. And then they think, okay, well, this is happening now when I'm 50 and I'm exposed to this in my workplace. But it's sort of like I always think of it as like a thread that links traumas in our lives, whether we want it to or not. And the more of those traumas that we have, it sort of acts cumulatively. And sometimes people can have PTSD or this secondary trauma reactions that sort of happen later on. And it seems like, wow, I've already gone through all these things, but it's not necessarily a exact linear kind of fashion, but the more times that you do have trauma, the more likelihood you are to develop these responses. So like you could go back and look at some of those like risk factors. Does that answer that question? I hope. Yeah.
Yeah, I
It's
think so.
complicated. It's not like sort of A plus B equals C. It's just sort of we have to look at correlations, but definitely those folks working with, children, abuse, you know, refugees, homeless, veterans, you know, any of those kinds of criminal cases and things that have disturbing material are at more risk for sure. They were saying organizationally, sometimes it's having a rotation through like different departments for, you know, like in a, say in a public defender's office, like where you're not always handling that same type of cases continually, that there's some kind of rotation can help buffer it as well.
Great, thank you. So I have another question here.
Yeah.
Do you have any experience with or thoughts about the effectiveness of EMDR to treat PTSD?
I'm not personally certified in EMDR. I'm certified in prolonged exposure and cognitive processing therapy, and some other things. But, you know, therapists that do it really, you know, if they're trained in it and certified in it, I think it can be an effective way to treat trauma, and research has shown that. There is some research too that shows that even without the eye movement, because it's basically it's using sort of an eye movement while you're telling the story of the trauma, but they found that even the without that piece of it, it's still effective. So my personal bias is it's the processing of it, and you can do that in many different ways, and it's usually best to work with a therapist who's trained in treating trauma, and if they have a particular way that they're more comfortable doing that, then work with them on that, and if it's EMDR, then go for it.
Oh, great. Let's see. So somebody else wrote, love work from home, but I am curious, is there any research on whether that blurs boundaries and exasperates secondary trauma? I hope that's what they meant, WFH.
Like working from home.
Yes.
um Well, I mean, I think that when people have flexible schedules, it shows that they're happier workers, right? Whether that be hours or location or having, you know, some variety of in office, out of office, things like that, then they're less stressed and they're more effective and they're more productive workers, actually. So that can be, I think, a good way of caring for yourself if that option is available. The only sort of downside is that you have to have, like what I was saying, is boundaries around your work from home environment. So that means like you're working, when you're not working, you put it away. You know, you turn off the phone, you turn off the computer, you walk away, that you have some sort of like rituals or even just physical space that separates your home life from your work life. Because I think it could easily, if you have the demand for, you know, billing a lot of hours and a lot of time at work, that it could really trickle into your personal life in a way that you don't want. So for some people, it's better to go to the office and then come home, and then they know when they're home, they're away from it. So it just depends on you. I think overall, the flexibility of schedules is a positive thing for people's mental health from what the things that I've read. But you got to have good boundaries about it.
Very good. Okay, another question here. The attendee writes, I've seen other presentations with the ACEs tree and the pair of ACEs, which have longer lists of trauma events and speak to the cumulative impact of smaller events over time. They mentioned you don't seem to subscribe to that. Can you speak more on that?
I guess I'm not quite understanding the question. I mean, I think smaller traumas over time can accumulate to become contribute to secondary trauma. So, or to PTSD. But I think to meet the full criteria for PTSD, it would have to be something that is like a serious threat to life or limb, or witnessing that to someone else to meet the strict criteria of PTSD. But for secondary trauma, burnout, things like that, a lot of times that may not meet the full criteria for PTSD, but it's those cumulative exposures to traumatic events or to traumatic material can definitely contribute to having these reactions. It's not just one big thing, it could be many small things. Yes. And again, for legal professionals where you're working with it, you know, material or clients or cases that do have that sort of cumulative small things, it's something that you have to really watch, and it can kind of sneak up on you before you know it. You're starting to have some of these responses like I was mentioning.
Oh, perfect. So we have one more question here, and I also just
Okay.
wanted to answer just a few questions that came in. People are asking if a copy of the presentation will be available. So I will
Sure.
get with Dr. Lee on that. And also someone else asked if the presentation will be posted. And yes, we will post the recording on legalfuel.com under the free CLE. So you can look for that there along with any of the materials for the program. So just wanted to answer those questions. So the last one for you, Dr. Lee, the attendee writes, thank you. Based on some of the statistics you've seen, would you recommend that law firms and or the Florida Bar provide a CLE training for newer attorneys entering the legal field to practice either criminal, family, or immigration law?
I mean, I'm not in a position to make a recommendation one way or the other about that, but just from my perspective, I think the more training, especially early on or even in law schools, I think it would be fantastic for people. I think it's hard because, if you just narrow it to certain fields, I mean, those are maybe at more high risk, but there could be exposed to traumatic material in some of the other areas as well. Like you just don't know, like, you know, so I would think it would be helpful early on for everyone that's going into the legal field. And then um, certainly firms or departments or units or whatever that are working with really high risk trauma, intensive could have even more programming or systemic sort of trainings and things that they could do. That would be my suggestion.
Good. Well, it looks like we've reached the end of the webinar. I want to thank everyone for attending today, and special thanks to you, Dr. Lee. We really appreciate your time.
Oh, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. And I wish everyone the best. And I appreciate you attending.